Hi everyone, it's Elise from Kid and Clouder Colouring Classes, and today I'm going to be showing you how to colour a simple dirt ground. Now I really wanted to show you this really simple tutorial here today because you can use it under absolutely any image at all to create a really simple grounding effect. It works great on a big variety of images, so think if you've got your character stamps, you can create a dirt ground for them to be standing on. Your gardening stamps are amazing for this as well because oftentimes they will have a little bit of dirt or soil sort of mixed in there as well. So you can reuse this technique on so many different images, but it's not a technique that we often think that we really need to search a tutorial for. So I hope this mini lesson will be really helpful for you today and that you can take what you learn and start applying it elsewhere. Now this technique is actually one of the chapters from our brand new Grand Gardens colouring class, which is our June 2021 colouring project over at Kid and Clouder Colouring Classes. So if you'd like to colour the rest of this image up with me, come and join us over in the classroom. We break it down all step by step, just like we're doing in this video here today. So it's nice and simple, even if you're just starting out with your markers and you're a beginner. If you're already a class member, consider starting with this tutorial here today if you've been a little bit nervous to jump in or a little bit time poor. Making small goals like this and even just putting aside 10 minutes of coloring is all you need to make a little start and take a mindful break for your self-care to recharge and de-stress and just focus on a project here in the present moment. So let's go ahead and jump in. Now when colouring any object at all, it's really important to first keep in mind light source. Now if you've watched our tutorials before, I always go through this because we always need to be making sure that we refer back to light source because without it, we don't actually see any objects in our scene. So we need light to be able to see the form of objects. So typically in our classes, we work with what's called ambient lighting, which is a major source of light in the scene like the sun or overhead lighting, and it casts big cones of light over your entire project, rather than say one side light and the opposite side dark. The way that we approach ambient lighting, and it's the most flattering lighting for portraiture or just basic scenes like this, is anything that's raised up toward us is going to appear lightest and brightest because my light rays come down and it hit those raised up areas first. We call those raised up areas our highlights. They're the lightest and brightest parts of the object. Now opposite that is your shadow, and these are the parts that are further back or slanting down away from those light rays that come through. Then in between your highlight and shadow, you have midtone, which is generally considered the true color of the object because it's not affected by light or shade. Now we also have one more thing we want to think about, and that's cast shadows. Now this is one of the most important things that a lot of people don't just know because it's an art fundamental that you have to learn, but it's one of those things that helps you get a lot of depth in your projects. So when we have overlapping objects, so you can see here I'm holding something over my hand, and can you see the shadow that's on my hand there? That's a cast shadow. It's cast by an object in front or above onto an object below or behind. And what that's doing is it's showing the distance between these objects. So notice the closer these objects are, the darker and harder that shadow is. But the further apart they become, the softer and more dispersed that shadow is. So that's really going to help you create levels and depth in your projects. So it's really, really important to think about. Now don't worry if any of this stuff with light source feels a little bit overwhelming if you're new to it. Whenever we learn new techniques, there's always a learning curve, but the only way for this to become second nature is to practice it. So if you find this tricky today, it just means that you need a little bit more practice. So don't be afraid to go over the tutorial again, revisit this information. And we go over light source a lot in our free Markers 101 class. You can just find on the homepage at kidandclouder.com as well if you'd like to see more detail. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start to color up our dirt now. Now with our markers, I'm going to be working on creating all of this wonderful texture at the bottom here. And basically what we're doing is we're creating layers in the dirt, and we're creating mounds that are closer to us and then layering in behind, getting further back. So these ones down the bottom here are actually closest to our eye. And what we're essentially doing, you'll notice this darker color almost at the top of these peaks here. But what that is your cast shadow. So remember we talked about this before, anything that's in front is going to cast the shadow back. So think of these mounds of dirt as being in front of us, and then we've got the cast shadow directly behind it. And that's how we're creating each of these levels. So this dark line here is actually the cast shadow from this mountain of dirt which is in front. And then you're just working your way back. Now I've got quite a lot of detail here in this dirt scene that I'm doing, and that's because the artist themselves has drawn a lot of those lines in for me. If you're working with a character or something a little bit more simple, you can always simplify this down. There's not a right or wrong way for how many mounds of dirt you may want to show. So you may even have your character standing here and just do, say, 2 or 3 or 4 sort of around her to create that little bit of texture. And you can play around with changing that up to give you different looks. Now the texture stroke that I'm going to be using here today is actually called stippling. So when we do our coloring, there's several different shading methods you can use. So this is an actual real shading effect. I'm just going to show you with a lead pencil. So when you do shading, this is a little bit different from Copic blending. So I'm just mentioning this because the way we blend with markers, we're used to things like feathering and flicking, which are things that we go through in our Markers 101 class as well. But typically with art foundations, there's different ways that you can apply a medium to build up shading. So one of those is hatching, which is just lines like this. Now the closer your lines are together, the more it indicates a shadow. And the further out they're spaced, the more it indicates your highlight. Now we have cross hatching, which is the same thing, but it's back and forth. We have scumbling, which is like a little bit of a scribbly stroke like this, same sort of thing. The more dense those scribbles are together, the more it's like shadowing, the more spaced out, the more it's like your highlight. And we have stippling. Now stippling is essentially little dots like this. And again, it's the same thing. The closer these are and the more dense they are, the more it's going to look like a shadow. And the more we space them out, the more it becomes like a highlight. Now this isn't to be confused with pointillism. Pointillism is an actual art style, not a shading technique, where the whole image is just done in a series of dots. So this is a very different sort of approach. Now with our markers, we can use the stippling technique here today to help us create texture like the dirt. And we'll build it up with the different colors like we would a normal color blend. So rather than just using the one color, we'll be able to fade the colors and get the gradient so it looks a little bit more like dirt here today. So I'm going to be using my E40s, and I really like these for doing grounding because they're more gray-based browns. So let's go ahead and jump in. I'm actually going to start with my darkest color here, which is E49. I'm just going to pop this off to the side now. So all I'm going to do is I've got the little lines already drawn in here. If you don't have drawn lines, it's really simple. You can just grab a lead pencil and just create your own lines. So I might even do some of my own in here as well. So you can see I hold the pencil nice and soft, and I'm able to just sort of create my own lines on the page. By holding the pencil soft, you get a natural bump as you pull it along the page, which will help to create this texture for you. The great thing about doing this with a lead pencil is you don't need any drawing skills. You can always erase it until you're happy with the result. Now starting with E49, I'm going to do that stippling technique we talked about. Now I'm just coming back to the bottom to show you. I'm going to hold the marker upright and I'm going to be working predominantly on the point. And I'm basically going to be smooshing a whole bunch of dots together. Now as I'm finishing with the color, I'm going to start spacing them out a bit more, just like we talked about before. then we'll come in and fill in these gaps with other colors as well. What we want to try and avoid today is doing all the dots in a straight line like this, because that's going to look very linear, and especially if we fill a lot of the space in, it's going to give us a line rather than that blended edge. So we want to try and avoid just straight lines. Try and break it up with a few random dots so you're able to get that fade out of the color. Now, when we work on the tip of the marker, sometimes the marker can get a little bit clogged up with the pigment. So when you finish this, you always want to just rub it out on all sides of the marker just to remove any buildup of the ink as well. If your markers are ever sticky or shiny, this means it needs a little bit of cleaning with some rubbing alcohol, some isopropyl, or your colorless blender you can use as well. This is generally due to a buildup just from doing something like this, like working on the tip of the marker. And people tend to do that a lot when they're starting out because you're trying to get those really fine lines. Okay, so we've gone through the technique quite a bit. Let's actually start the coloring. So I'm going to start with E49. Now you can actually come through and very lightly sort of trace that line first. What this does is it gives you a starting point. So rather than just coming in and doing your dots, sometimes you can get little bits of white showing through underneath this. This gives us a starting point and that we can go through and add our dots from. So we've got basically like a grounding line. And it doesn't need to be perfect, it's just a little bit messy, a little bit quick. And you can see I'm starting to build my dots up from here. Now they're not in a straight line. I'm making sure that I try and space all of these out. Now notice that I'm basically drawing above the line that the artist has drawn here right now, because remember we're doing our cast shadows. So we're effectively shading behind each mound of the dirt. Now, if you get any parts like this here where it feels a bit, you don't have a lot of texture and maybe your dots are very close together, just come through and try and break it up a little bit more. Now, where I have little details like this that are sitting in front of the dirt, I'm going to add a bit of an outline around just so it doesn't get lost. Again, if I just came through and just started doing dots like this next to it, sometimes that outline can just become a little bit fuzzy. By coming around this, it's not so much a cast shadow, but it's more just identifying it on the page so I don't lose it there. And you can see I apply my dots, so instead of having that hard line, I'm breaking that down, giving it the same texture as the rest of the ground. Now when you get to the top, you won't be adding any color behind this because that's going to be whatever background treatment you're going to apply. So it'll just fade out to your lightest color at the top of that mound. And I'm allowing these strokes to just sort of fade out onto the sides here. Okay, so let's just do that little section first. Okay, now once you've done that, I'm going to grab my next color, which is E44, and I'm basically just going to apply straight over the top of what I've done previously and start to extend a little further out. Now don't worry about blending out those lines so much. Now on that side, I didn't really do any dots. I'm not actually really doing in this space, so I'm just going to do that really quickly. I haven't done a lot of the detail in here, so let me just come down to the bottom. Now I'm basically just doing the stippling straight over the top and then just extending a little further out. And it's the same thing, we just want to avoid that hard line by spacing out your dots as you're getting ready to finish with this color. Now if you end up with a line and this is your first time trying the technique, don't be too hard on yourself. That's absolutely okay. Whenever you try techniques for the first time, it's always going to be a teething process. You always have to refine what you're learning. So be kind to yourself if you don't quite get it today. If you ever find a technique hard and you're not quite satisfied with the result, it just means that you need to do a little bit more practice. You've actually identified the perfect lesson for you to do. So if you ever do a class or a tutorial and you think, gee, that was really tough, that's perfect. That's exactly what you want. What is the point of doing a tutorial if you already know how to do it or it's really simple? You won't actually be learning a lot or taking anything away. So don't ever be upset if something does push you a little bit beyond what you already know or what's comfortable. Now I am going to come just down to the front because we want to do a little bit of shading in this first mound. So it'll look like that we've got a little bit of that dirt there. So I'm just going to come on the other side. So we're going to fade down as well. So we want this to fade out to light at the bottom. So it shows that the actual dirt that we're coloring up has a bit of that color gradation too. It doesn't just start with white. Okay, so E43 is next, straight over the top, and I'm extending a little further out. Now, some of these mounds are going to start coming in close to each other now. So you can join some of these up if they do. Notice on the sides that I'm bringing these out almost horizontal, and they're slowly fading away. Typically, ground will always be horizontal because you're working with the horizon line. So try and make it a little flat. Now don't worry if your dots are really standing out at the moment. We do quite a few layers of this technique to build up that texture. At the moment they might feel really circular and you might not be getting that dirt effect. Alright, the next color I'm going to be using a little bit of E41 and we're just doing the same thing. So just doing our stippling straight over the top and extending a little further out. Make sure that you space out your little dots here, especially as you come to the top of these shapes. If we're just dabbing over the whole thing, it's just going to look blended. Whenever you work with textures, it's always the space between your texture that makes it stand out, not the actual stroke itself. So that's the same when you do flicking as well. It's the actual strokes between that make your strokes stand out. It's not how fine those strokes actually are. Okay, now that's one round of the blend. You can see it's very different. We're going to go from that to that. So very different at this point. We need to build the color up with a few more layers. This will also help to get rid of that very circular look because you're essentially just smooshing more dots straight on top of each other, which just flattens everything down a little bit more. So we just start with E49 and we just come in again and apply where we did the previous. Now don't worry too much about where your dots were laid the first time around. We're not worrying about getting these directly on top of each other. We're basically just worried about following the same shapes and directions. Next color is E44 and we're just doing the same thing, just dabbing straight over the top and extending a little bit further out. Alright, next color, E43. And we're just doing the same thing. So don't be afraid to extend your lines further than the artist drawn lines as well. This will always give you a bit more of that natural fade effect. Always come back over the very darkest colors too, smooshing in all the colors in together, filling in the spaces with different colors so you can get that variation, and that just helps it not look flat as well. So you're not leaving white in your shadow areas because it gets filled with each lightest color that you come in and use. But as we get toward our highlight, the very top peaks of these mounds, we do want to leave those gaps between the dabs. E41 is next. And you can see really just fading out the sides now, fading out the bottom. And if you really want it to fade out even further, you can use E40, which will just really just fade that even out to the white of the paper. I can show you that in 2 seconds. I would really only use that on the sides of the bottom, so it's not necessary, but it can help you. You can see it's so soft, so you just get that really natural fade out the whole way around. And that is our dirt grounding technique. So really simple to do. And now I'm just going to repeat this on the other side. Now you can continue layering as well. So if you're not quite happy with the texture or the color, just repeat the previous steps again to continue building it up. All right, now that's our image all done. Now remember, we're going to go from this to this. So you always need a little bit of perspective and have the whole image colored up, because once you've just done a small part of a technique, it doesn't feel like much on the page. We really need to finish it up to give that perspective and to see how everything comes together at the end. Now, I really hope you've enjoyed this quick lesson on how to color up dirt or create grounding around your character stamps. You can try this technique on any image at all. You can use any browns as well to get different looks. But remember, coloring takes time and practice to learn, so your results may not be instantly the same as mine or others you may see, but the more you practice, the easier it gets. If you'd like to color the rest of this image with me, please come and join us over at kitandclouder.com to view our new Grand Gardens coloring class. It's on sale until July 14th, and you'll receive lifetime access to do it at your own pace, so you're never on any time limits when you do our classes. We also don't have any lock-in contracts ever to do our classes as well, so you can come and go as you please. And we'll be breaking down the very, very basics in this class, just like we did here today in this tutorial. So even if you're new to coloring, you can feel confident that we're going to go nice and slowly and help you learn these techniques so you can apply them to any image at all after the class. I really hope you've enjoyed this lesson. Please give me a follow if you haven't already, and if you think anyone would find this helpful, I'd love if you would consider sharing or tagging them as well. Thank you so much for watching, and happy coloring.